Today we're going to be doing our last discussion of the U.S. Army in the West as it pertains to kind of our look at New Mexico history. We started with, of course, Fort Marcy, and looking at some of the systemic corruption within the military system as it was stationed in Santa Fe, and of course evidence of alcohol and drug use amongst the soldiers. And we then looked at the mass grave at Glorieta, the Confederate mass grave, to see what the realities of war were like in the 19th century. And for this last talk in the series, we're going to be looking at another case study. Of course, our first case study was Fort Marcy. The second was mass grave. This one will be on an archaeological project at Bosque Redondo. We'll be looking at how the U.S. Army interacted with indigenous populations. And so some of this will be a little bit of review, but most of it won't. And I'm going to try to focus on the aspects that aren't. But bear in mind, all three of these lectures are usually given as standalone lectures, so there is some overlap. First and foremost, any story begins with the Mexican-American War. And this should be reviewed from the Fort Marcy lecture. The Mexican-American War began as a border dispute, but ended with the annexation of over half of Mexico to the United States under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. It was a relatively short war, lasting approximately 2 years, and saw some victories by the Mexican armies, the most notable of which was the initial stopping of U.S. forces in California. But overall, it was a very one-sided war with the United States winning over Mexico. And as you might remember from the Fort Marcy lecture, one of the things General Stephen Watts Kearny did on his way down to conquer Santa Fe and to conquer New Mexico is make this promissory speech over and over and over again. Every place they went, he would say, this is a quote specifically from his speech in Las Vegas, but all of them were about the same. From the Mexican government, you never receive protection. The Apaches and Navajos come down from the mountains and carry off your sheep and even your women. Whenever they please, my government will correct all of this. It will keep off the Indians. So the U.S. Army came into New Mexico with the promise to New Mexico's residents that what they were going to do is find a problem for the indigenous, find a solution for the indigenous peoples, which was a major problem at this point. As we talked about with our earlier Jemez lectures, there were large Spanish land grants, such as the San Diego land grant, which had been completely abandoned due to Navajo raids during this period. So the U.S. Army promising to stop Apache and Navajo raids was a big, important promise to many of these folks living in the newly founded New Mexico territory. Of course, he's saying this, but ultimately, as we looked at in the Fort Marcy lecture, he didn't really mean this. What he said was to keep people in line and make them feel good about the U.S. Army coming in. The reality is he was building a military installation to level their houses in Santa Fe if they showed the least sign of revolt. But this was the promise. And this lecture is how the United States government tried, in its own weird way, to follow through on this promise. So New Mexico territory at the end of the Mexican-American War, obviously you've seen this slide before, it was a very, very large territory. It's not the New Mexico you know today. But if you take it's a little off-center, but not that much. If you just do a bullseye on New Mexico territory, the heart of New Mexico territory as it existed in 1850, if you were to do a bullseye in the middle of it, that's where the Navajo were. And so while it included these large amounts of areas, the heart of this gigantic territory was the country in which the Navajo peoples lived in 1850. And as it says here, it eventually got added to under the Gadsden Purchase, included portions of Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, and was all administered from Santa Fe initially. So the first attempt at making good on the U.S. promise to stop the Navajo from raiding was in 1849. On September 9th, Lieutenant Colonel John Washington left with a detachment of dragoons from Fort Marcy for the first U.S. expedition to the Dinnitah. In fact, I've written about this in multiple contexts. So the most famous context of which I tend to write about this is about him stopping in Jemez on the way. And of course, him and the soldiers going down into the Jemez Kivas and then taking a tour and becoming You're looking at there the first tourist to New Mexico or to Jemez Historic Site. Colonel Washington actually took a day trip up to Kuaua Pueblo in Jemez Springs and got to see the old Spanish mission in Jemez Historic Site. But he ended up going on from there with supplies and scouts from Jemez, and ended up killing a very powerful Navajo chief by the name of Narbona at a place in the Chusca Mountains, which is now known as Narbona or Washington Pass. And ultimately, this campaign with the Dragoons ended with a peace treaty being signed at the mouth of Canyon de Chelly, pretty much where like Chinle is today. And the U.S. Army thought, well, good. They all patted themselves on the back. And of course, not being anywhere near a U.S. military installation at the time, they just kind of went home. That didn't last, of course. As U.S. military began to encroach more and more onto the Navajos' homeland, the Navajo launched an attack at Fort Defiance in the spring of 1860. They launched an attack at Fort Defiance, and in the spring of 1860, the Secretary of War in Washington, D.C. said, we need to do another expedition, a punitive expedition to kind of punish these Navajo raiders. And this expedition was led by a man by the name of John Canby, or Edward Canby. I'm sorry, Major Edward Canby, who would eventually be General Canby. He pretty much gathers U.S. military forces from all the surrounding military installations, including Fort Marcy and Santa Fe, and he arrives in the Chusca Mountains. He slaughters livestock, burns homes, and pretty much the U.S. Army stays in the area as a peacekeeping force. So I know that sounds horrible. You say, well, they're a peacekeeping force. They did all these horrible things, and then they stay there as a peacekeeping force? Yes. And the idea was that they did all these horrible things, but they had to stay there to prevent the Navajo from moving out of the area and causing reprisals on the New Mexico citizens. So the U.S. Army stayed there. But if you can notice, there's a problem with that date, because in the 1860s, we are on the verge of the American Civil War. And in fact, news reaches New Mexico in May of 1861. So shortly thereafter, the U.S. Army hears that there's a bigger war. There's a new enemy. There's the Confederate enemy. And most of the professional U.S. Army soldiers leave. In fact, Canby returns to Santa Fe, where he starts to raise the 1st and 2nd New Mexico Volunteer Infantry. Perhaps not surprisingly, when that occurs, the Navajos begin to raid again in earnest. You could almost say if you wanted to justify a cycle of violence, think of it this way. Their lands, the U.S. Army had destroyed and burned their fields, so they had no food or supplies. So they turned to the other option they had, which is taking those supplies from others. And that's exactly what they did when the U.S. Army pulled out. Now, of course, the first phase of the American Civil War ended with Lieutenant Colonel John Baylor coming up from El Paso, quickly capturing Mesilla and proclaiming it the Confederate state of Arizona. It was followed by a second Confederate invasion in 1861, or later on. That invasion was led by Sibley, armed out of San Antonio, Texas, with the bold plans of conquering New Mexico, Colorado, and California. At the same time, Colorado was mustering its own volunteers from the north, and both the groups, both the Texas forces and Colorado forces met at the Battle of Glorieta Pass, which ended up resulting in a Confederate victory on the battlefield. But while they were winning the battle on the battlefield, some of the Colorado volunteers, led by Shivington, actually located and burned their supply train, and the Confederates fled south. And of course, the last time we talked specifically, looked at the Confederate dead that died, taking some of those points. What you see there is an image of a reproduction of what might have happened on Sharpshooter's Ridge, right above the farmhouse, which name escapes me at the moment, but not important for this talk. You can see some Confederates laying on the floor. Those are the guys that would end up in the mass grave. But back to our story. Colorado volunteers and the Texas volunteers duke it out. And then both of them, after duking it out with one another and determining that New Mexico is going to remain part of the Union, they both go home. And into this absence, the Californians arrive. On September 18th, so about 6 months later, this guy here, General Carleton, arrives from California with the California Column. And he establishes command pretty much as a military dictator in Santa Fe at Fort Marcy. You can see Carleton here. If he looks like the devil, he kind of is, and we're going to show why in a few minutes. But Carleton arrives. Now, Carleton has his own ideas of how you solve the Indian problem. So we saw an earlier general give his idea, trying to sell that we're going to take care of these things. So Carleton has a bold new idea, which is there aren't going to be any talks. So I'll read this off real quick, but you can read along with me as you're looking on the slides. There is to be no council held with the Indians, nor any talks. The men are to be slain whenever and wherever they can be found. The women and children may be taken as prisoners, but of course they are not to be killed. If they beg for peace, their chiefs and 20 of their principal men must come to Santa Fe to have a talk here, but tell them fairly and frankly that you will keep after their people and slay them until you receive orders to desist from this headquarters. The Mescalero learn of this almost immediately, and they unfortunately send up a delegation that the U.S. Army finds in the Galisteo Basin. So the delegation on its way to Santa Fe is making its way to Santa Fe to talk peace. And Carleton soldiers come across this delegation. Of course, the men hold up a sign of truce, and this is actually in my Fort Marcy report, and the soldiers gun them down just to show them that they're not joking around. If you don't make it to Santa Fe alive, we're going to kill you wherever you are. And it's a very, very brutal tactic. It's a total war cast against indigenous peoples. And at this point, when he means indigenous or Indians, he means primarily these more nomadic peoples, these Apaches and Navajos that are spread more on the landscape. Pueblo peoples have been at peace with the U.S. government since the Taos revolt in 1847, and most of that was not even indigenous peoples. So primarily when we're talking about Indians, he's talking about Apaches and Navajos, which are ethnologically very similar peoples, but distinct from one another. The first solution is, of course, the Mescalero campaign, as I already mentioned. Carson was told to spearhead this campaign with the 1st New Mexico Cavalry. So these are New Mexico residents going out on horseback to deal with the Mescalero. The campaign against the Mescalero is incredibly short. It lasts approximately 3 months. And is followed the next year. So they winter over the year of the winter of 1862, 1863, before beginning their campaign against the Navajo. And it's important to note that while this is spearheaded by the 1st New Mexico Cavalry, the various parts of the California column would participate, as well as Hopi, Jemez, Ute, and Zuni auxiliary. So the traditional enemies of the Navajo, the indigenous peoples that were the traditional enemies of the Navajo, also participated in these campaigns. And these were considered justified by the fact that the Navajo had begun raiding New Mexican settlements as soon as they had turned their back on them, which made the U.S. government feel like that they did not honor their treaties. And it resulted in very tactically in both the Mescaleros and Navajos cases a scorched earth policy. The battle against the Navajo would last almost a year, culminating in January of 1864 with the Battle of Canyon de Chelly. In typical Carson fashion, he led a detachment of the 1st New Mexico Cavalry right into the canyon. They killed 23 Navajos, but the primary purpose of the attack was not to necessarily kill Navajos. The Navajos were, in most cases, too stealthy and would just avoid direct conflict with the U.S. Army. Instead, they would just retreat or disappear onto the landscape when the U.S. Army arrived. But what they did is that while they could disappear onto the landscape, their livestock couldn't. Their fields couldn't. So what the battle ended up being was not so much a stand-up fight, but rather a burning of the fields and killing of the livestock. So you destroy, in this case, what he's doing in this total war is he's destroying the indigenous people's way of life. He's destroying So they won't have food for the winter. They'll have to come to terms. They won't be able to survive. They'll need the U.S. Army. They'll be dependent upon the U.S. government to live. And that's exactly what happens. The campaign is very successful in destroying all the food reserves the Navajo people have. And the Navajo people begin to surrender in hundreds at the Fort Defiance and Fort Wingate, which are the closest U.S. Army installations there. And you can see those in the lower left-hand slide as far as their closeness to Canyon de Chelly. You have your Fort Defiance, and then a little closer you have Fort Wingate. The U.S. Army doesn't necessarily accept them at these posts and instead directs them under gunpoint to the east. And in the middle of winter, remember, it's January when this occurs. This is a bad time for this to happen. They're marched east to Bosque Redondo. It's 300 miles from Fort Defiance in Canyon de Chelly all the way to Bosque Redondo and the Fort Sumner Indian Reservation along the Pecos River. The military post was established in November of 1862. Remember, that's at the end of that Mescalero War, and it was meant to house the Mescalero Indians. It's located on the Pecos River at just south of the modern-day town of Fort Sumner, New Mexico, and housed approximately 400 Mescalero Apache initially. But then in 1864, more than 7,000 Navajo arrived. The entire military post and Indian reservation was constructed under the order of Carleton to serve as a buffer between the Hispanic and Anglo settlements along the Rio Grande and the Comancheria to the east. It's important to note that while this is solving the Apache and Navajo problem, the Comanche are still free and still fighting. This is actually years before the Red River War would eventually end that conflict with the Comanche. The plan of Fort Sumner, I mean, of course, based, largely like comparing it to Fort Marcy per se, it's relatively small. The post is relatively small. It was designed to house cavalry units, only cavalry. It has no defensive structures. There's never a star fort built there or a blockhouse. And most of the post is actually dedicated to agriculture. And it should note that even on this map here, most of the post is unmapped and including all the places for Indian housing. So this is where the U.S. soldiers lived. I talked a little bit about this in my Fort Marcy talk, but a quick definition of a concentration camp is a place where large numbers of people, especially political prisoners or members of persecuted minorities, are deliberately imprisoned in a relatively small area with inadequate facilities, sometimes to provide forced labor and to await mass execution. Under that definition, Bosque Redondo could be interpreted as a concentration camp. In fact, the Apache and Navajo were concentrated in an area of less than 20 square miles. Now, remember, that area was supposed to originally feed and house a couple hundred Mescalero, not 7,000 Navajo. And these groups that chose to go to this Pecos area are unaccustomed to intensive agriculture, which they have to do along the Pecos River to survive. They can't hunt outside this 20-mile square radius. That's not enough area to keep huge amounts of livestock, and drought and insect infestations cause the crops to fail. Roughly a quarter of those people concentrated at Bosque Redondo Indian Reservation died due to disease and starvation. Interestingly enough, the soldiers jokingly referred to this blight on United States history as Carltonia, because Carleton envisioned this place. He when he was told that the bugs were destroying the crops, he just recommended that the Indians pick the bugs off the corn. But to the Navajo, the soldiers may have jokingly referred to it as Carltonia. To the Navajo, it was Wieldy, or the place of suffering. And it was a failed experiment. Conditions within the reservation were extremely poor. The Army was unable to care for thousands forced to live at the reservation, and under the cover of darkness, the Mescalero flee the reservation in 1865. Their numbers were never very large to begin with, and the U.S. government lets them go. 2 years later, with the finishing off of the American Civil War, the U.S. government starts to take stock of all of its different activities during the War of Rebellion. They become fully aware of Carleton's actions and remove him from power in New Mexico in 1867. So Carleton's no longer in power. In 1868, the U.S. government officially meets with Navajo chiefs and signs a treaty, the Navajo Treaty of 1868, allowing the Navajo to leave Bosque Redondo and resettle their traditional homeland. A year later, the post was closed, officially closed. If you look here at these graphic, before I start talking about archaeology necessarily, you can see the way the Navajo Nation has grown since from 1868 to its present day, more or less. The big little outline you see where it doesn't, like, what is that thing in the middle of the Navajo reservation that's not Navajo? That's the Hopi Reservation, just to be clear. But you can see here, most interestingly enough, if you look at these different time periods as far as layout goes, most of the initial reservation was actually in what is the present day state of New Mexico. And since then, they've acquired a lot of land in Arizona, to where most of the Navajo reservation is actually in Arizona today. You don't need to worry about all of it that comes here, but I like to try to put some context on what I'm going to talk about, what I did while I was out at Bosque Redondo. First and foremost, Bosque Redondo was by 1960s, State Monuments was looking to acquire new properties and kind of develop its narrative. And one of the places that had been chosen as a place that was very important to New Mexico history, and I think we can see this just by the brief overview I've given of the topic, was Fort Sumner. And so in 1967, Alfred Dittert compiled a document that pretty much promoted which historical archaeological sites in New Mexico could be developed as state monuments and as tourist destinations. And there was a lot of them in there posed. Some of them included upgrades to places that already existed as state monuments, but some of them were completely new. For example, people don't think of this, but one of the places they were arguing as a development for historic tourism was, of course, Taos, West Las Vegas. You can also see on there Mesilla, which Mesilla Plaza was already a state monument at that time. But this document that technically is credited to the governor at the time, but was actually written by Alfred Dittert, who compiled it along with a couple other archaeologists at the time in the Museum of New Mexico. We're really trying to sell the development of all these places. Most of them never became state monuments, but Fort Sumner did. And in 1968, 1965, Jack Wilson excavated some of the historic structures, including two of the privies in the enlisted men's barracks. More recently, jumping way up into the future, Mike Marshall did a survey of a proposed wetland pond. And in 2003, Rick was on board, and Rick Raycraft did some minor surveys. And then Richard Montoya, who's still at the OAS today, monitored the construction of the Bosque Redondo Memorial, which you can see pictured here. I came in 2012. So between 1968 and 2012, there really hadn't been any real excavation at the site. They've done some survey, but CJ Law, who was the manager out there at the time, was really interested in taking the back side of the museum and turning it into animal pens for a small herd of churro sheep. Since then, it's morphed into all sorts of things. I'm sure Aaron could give Aaron Roth, who's the current manager there, could give a great history of how that space has been reutilized. But my goal was to identify and mitigate the archaeological resources in that area, and I did that. And so I was given the project and constructed a team of Anglo, i.e. me, and Don Tatum was also part of it, Comanche, Mary Wiaki, a Hispanic, oh God, I think Rick Montoya was actually out on my crew during that, but there were some other people as well. And then Navajo, Isaiah Cohen, who still works for the Office of Archaeological Studies, and Vernon Foster were both on that team as well in 2012. Interestingly enough, it was during this excavation. In fact, it was probably where this picture was that I sat on a bucket talking to Rick And at the time, he joked to me that the manager position was open at Lincoln. And I said, I would never take the manager position at Lincoln. I said, now, if Jemez opened up, I take the position at Jemez. And 2 months later, I was interviewing for the position as manager of Jemez Historic Site and got that position. So this project obviously has a lot of link to my own career necessarily. But the project area consisted of about 16.5 acres. And it actually, if you look at this photo here, this photo actually shows the structures that were in the area investigated. And that includes the fort stables, the Indian commissary, and the corn cribs. Corn cribs are those things that look like they have bushes drying on top of them, kind of in the distance between the bigger buildings. That area had been subject to flooding and intensive farming in the 20th century, and the state of preservation was far from clear. In fact, when I went through the documents that Jack Wilson had written about it, one of the things he kept saying was they had mud foundations, adobe foundations, which I said at the time just meant that he never found the real foundations, because at that point I was a hot shot. I'd already excavated Fort Marcy and several other military posts, and I was like, there's no way the U.S. Army would have used packed earth for their foundations. The U.S. Army did things one way, and that was the U.S. Army way. I was going to prove to be wrong on that. Let's keep going on. So we started with a pedestrian survey, resulting in the collection of about 900 surface artifacts. Those included native ceramics, hand-forged horseshoes, one of which you can see here, harness hardware, so things that fix onto the horse and the buckles and so on, as well as U.S. military buttons and lead bullets. These artifacts are curated at the Museum of Indian Arts and Culture, and the majority of the artifacts are believed to date to the 1860s. Not all of the artifacts were diagnostic, and there's certainly some from some later dates, but most of those 900, about 800 of the 900 artifacts, or a little bit more than that, clearly dated to the 1860s and to the Fort Sumner and the Bosque Redondo Indian Reservation. And there was two pretty much clusters of the artifacts, one associated with the stable and one associated with the commissary. And you can imagine that the horseshoes and the harness pieces were associated with the stables, and then the ceramics and some of the other pieces were associated with the commissary. In addition to that, we excavated 4 by half a meter test trenches by hand in these various locations. And the goal of these was to test a lot of things. But more importantly, I was looking for the foundations for the structures. I believed Jack Wilson was completely wrong, and that I was going to prove that there are stone foundations underneath there. And then we're also going to, we tested the deposition of some of the midden or kitchen waste associated with the soldiers and Native American peoples. And you can see some of those trenches. I got one in the foreground, but if you look, there's a couple more kind of further along. You can see people kind of clustered out there in the field. This is all beautiful green grass now, by the way. Aaron keeps it in really good shape, but it looked like this when I was out there working on it. Come to find out, there was absolutely packed earth adobe foundations. They don't look like much. This is what they look like. So if you look here at this slide, you'll see where the 30 centimeter measuring block is. There is a darker colored soil that represents the packed earth of the stables. I think that picture is of the stables. It could be of the commissary, but it's of one of the structures. They're definitely packed earth, which was surprising to me, as it was atypical of U.S. Army construction, and actually supports the conclusion that these buildings, even though they look like U.S. Army buildings, were likely built with Native American labor using Native American building methods. And more likely than not, this would have been coerced labor by the U.S. Army, because if they don't do the labor, they don't get fed. And these are not wage-based jobs for the Navajo and Mescalero peoples. So that was quite surprising. And they're about, just so you know, they are U.S. standard-wise. They're 2 feet wide. They support a single story. We knew all of this coming into it. There was a lot of strong uses for the different architecture and ways of looking at things that we felt very strongly about, but the packed earth was surprising in and of itself. The other one was a Midden Deposit. The other surprises came from the Midden Deposit. We found quite a bit of animal bone, or not quite a bit. We found some animal bone, which included pieces of beef, lamb, and buffalo. We knew from historical records that beef was supplied by the U.S. Army. That was one of the things they gave the Navajo at Bosque Redondo, and the sheep were raised by the Navajo during that period. Well, they couldn't have had huge flocks at Fort Sumner. They had some. And the buffalo was a little more unexpected, and suggested foraging expeditions onto the eastern plains, encroaching on the area controlled by the Comanche. I didn't find this quote. Linda Sanchez, when she first heard me give this talk, said, I can tell you there is some historical documents that these guys were out buffalo hunting in these other areas. And this one was, this was a quote by Scout Big Mouth of the Mescalero Apache, but I think it holds true for the Navajo too, specifically about his time at Bosque Redondo. He said, one time they let our men go hunt near the Guadalupes because they not want to feed us. Our warriors made a solemn promise to return to our families with food, and they kept that promise. They brought back many, many loads of meat and hides. We made teepee coverings and clothing, and we ate good venison and buffalo. Sometimes the soldiers give us a little food, but not enough. A little tough beef, a little flour. We don't like wheat flour, and our buckskins wear out, and no deer to make more clothes. Every night a few of the young men run away, and some of the women. But the most of us stay and suffer. And we suffer. Pretty depressing. Well, fauna diversity, as we looked at in some other talks, does not represent abundance. You know, you'd think, well, God, they're eating lots of different animals. In this instance, we knew the U.S. Army was supposed to provide the Navajo with beef. The appearance of other food sources in there likely represents the inability of the Army to properly supply and care for Native American peoples forced to live at Bosque Redondo. Here we have a picture of the U.S. Army with guns in hands overlooking the Navajo peoples at Bosque Redondo. As illustrated by the Packed Earth Foundations, it is very likely these same peoples were coerced to build facilities for the U.S. Army. In addition to building these homes, they had to build their own homes for their families and labor in the reservation fields. So I have some conclusions, and I said this would be a shorter talk, and I do want to leave some time for questions today. But I believe that even though this was a very small archaeological project, that it really does change some of our perspectives at life at Bosque Redondo. First of all, Jack Wilson, who really didn't publish much of anything, I could prove that he's right. He absolutely was right. They're Packed Earth Foundations. I would have never believed it in a million years, and I bet most other military scholars would not believe it if they'd done work at other places. But it's true. Things are different at Fort Sumner. And in these findings, you know, this diversity of meat products and this found evidence that, as I said, I've got to credit Linda Sanchez with the finding of the account by Scout Big Mouth about living at the place. They demonstrate a potential to add to our understanding of the past, and that these places need to be preserved and to protect Mexico historic places and historic sites. I've given this talk a couple of different times to many, many different audiences, and one of the most powerful was to do this out in Shiprock, for a group of Navajo archaeologists who invited me out there to speak about this topic. But I think it's in some ways even more challenging amongst Anglo audiences, because the use of the word concentration camp can get on people's, you know, what do you mean the U.S. Army had concentration camps? That's not a concentration camp. Oppression is a difficult subject to discuss on all different terms. And I think Bosque Redondo reminds us of a very dark chapter in American history. But it's a very important chapter in American history. It's important to understanding where we were as a nation, and that at the end of the Civil War, things, you know, emancipation of slaves was a great move forward, but there were many other dark stories still to be written in the United States treatment of minorities. And I think the archaeological evidence presented here shows that this past remains with us, just buried beneath the surface. I mean, it's still there today. BB says, they're not buffalo, they're bison. Yes, they are absolutely. There are no real American buffalo. We use that word, but the things we have are actually bison. Overall, we tend to colloquially use the term American buffalo, but yes, they are technically a bison.
Right. Matt, this is Cheryl. Can you talk a bit about the end of the concentration camp in 1868? Who, it was Barboncito, I think, on the Navajo side, and then whoever on the Army side, and then what happened after that to get the Navajo back home?
They just got to go back home. In fact, I don't know a lot of the details about the return journey. We had a celebration since I did this presentation about the signing of the treaty not too long ago with New Mexico Historic Sites, and I know some of the people that are on this call had an opportunity along with me to be out there during this time, and I got to meet the oh God, I don't know if I apologize because I know this is being recorded. Vice President or Lieutenant Governor, I don't know which title they use at the Navajo Reservation, so I apologize for that. But I got to meet some of the officials at the Navajo Reservation during that time. My understanding is that the journey back was just as fraught with danger. And while I cannot speak directly to it, nor can I, in all fairness, I have to be clear, I'm giving a very Anglo perspective. So I'm talking a lot about archaeology and data, but I can't really capture the feelings of indigenous peoples when dealing with this experience. And I know there are, more importantly, as far as one of the things I've always felt strongly about, and I would encourage all of you to do as members of the public. I don't think we have any Navajo Americans on the call with us today, but I think it's almost important that more Anglo Americans visit the site, because unfortunately, the Navajo not wanting to visit the atrocities committed to them, that's understandable. But the only way United States, the Anglo citizens can understand how these actions they perpetrated had an impact on other peoples is to visit these sites and accept the fact. I'm also a strong advocate for the very same thing as far as people returning to concentration camps in Europe, because I think the best way for us not to forget and to understand and move past these atrocities is to recognize what we did, what we performed, and how those actions have had an impact on other people, and they continue to have an impact. And I may be in a minority of that. I'm not trying to crusade for any particular I mean, I guess I am supposedly, but I also think it's just a great, I think it's a great opportunity for us to learn. And I think it's got some great area. They're working on some new exhibits out there. And I'm actually hoping the Friends of Coronado Historic Site, when the new exhibits are ready, we will obviously work to get everybody out there and have a tour with Manager Roth, who's really passionate about it, and I think we'll have a great learning experience out there. So this is just, I guess, a tidbit of that. He could speak more to the history than I can. I can talk more about the archaeology. But what other questions do we have?
Cheryl asked how many people went back from Bosque Redondo when they were allowed to go home.
I don't know the numbers. We know a quarter of the people who were stationed there, about a quarter died, but I don't know the number off the top of my head. I'm sorry. If it was it'd be about 5,500 if you use that number. But of course, some people were born at the reservation too. So I don't know. Not all the Navajo people actually got on the reservation. Some hid out and didn't actually make it over. But aside, I mean, when you're talking about 7,000 people that usually live very, very dispersed on the landscape with large herds, the idea that you would corral them into 20 square miles, well, you sound like, oh, that's a big area. No, it's really not a big area. Also, of that 20 square miles, remember, this is pre-modern agriculture in many ways. So it's only that little sliver along the Pecos River that you can actually farm with your little acequias and stuff like that. And the people you have doing this farming, they're not Pueblo people. They may do some farming, but these guys are not the diehard farmers that the Jemez or the Caris peoples are. These are peoples that primarily live off livestock and hunting and gathering. So it was an alien environment to them. I mean, what would I say? Northwest New Mexico is a very, very different environment than the eastern plains of New Mexico. Very, very different. And in fact, some people argue that, in some ways, the lower Colorado Plateau it was probably a better environment for them and for their culture than necessarily the Pecos River staked plains kind of area.
I am just curious about Lieutenant Colonel John Washington, knowing that Martha Custis's granddaughter married Robert E. Lee. Was Lieutenant Colonel John Washington related to one of the brothers of George Washington?
Oh, I have no idea. That's a good question. And you'd think I'd know that since I did spend so much time researching Fort Marcy. I don't know, to tell you the truth. You know, I don't know. I really don't. I'm sorry, guys.
Just curious. Yeah, I know a lot of those families are really intermarried. A certain class of people, especially in the military.
Yeah. I unfortunately don't know. I wish I did. I really don't. Fort Sumner, interestingly enough, remember that's the same general. It's named after the same guy who said that we should abandon New Mexico altogether, and that Santa Fe was that sink of vice and extravagance. That's the same guy that the U.S. military post was named after, who hated it out here so much that he thought the U.S. government should give the land back to Mexico.
Too bad.
And Canby, who is the guy who led the expedition and, of course, served during the American Civil War, he ends up with the unceremonious title, if you Google him, of being the highest-ranking U.S. official to ever die in an Indian war. Not against the Navajo. He didn't die against the Navajo. But he decided later on during the Modoc War to go out. He was on the West Coast and said something stupid. Like he pretty much went, I don't think he was unarmed, but he didn't bring a lot of soldiers with him. He decided to go out to the Modoc and tell them exactly what they were going to do and how they were going to do it and how he was going to like it. And they killed him for that. So he died at the highest ranking official. But Carlton, of the Anglo peoples that we talked about in this, and unfortunately we have these, in many ways we have these big pictures of all these U.S. people, these U.S. soldiers and generals and lieutenants and officers that did some pretty horrible things. Carlton's probably the true villain of this story in particular. He actually firmly believed, and he thought he was creating a solution. But it goes to show that how you can get an idea. In fact, in many ways, I'm not necessarily comparing him with the Nazis, but it's interesting in the sense that he came up with a solution. And then even when it didn't really work, he continued down that path of that solution, causing the death and suffering of thousands because he was unwilling to change his mind to do those things. And that's pretty hard to stomach in many ways.
Was Carlton in Colorado? Because there was the guy that led the Sand Creek massacre also had similar views. Basically, he thought that all Indians should be shot and killed like you would kill flies, so they don't keep making more flies. I mean, that's
actually Shivington. So the hero of Glorieta Pass is the man who perpetrated the Sand Creek massacre.
Okay, so
Shivington, the guy who led the good fight for the Colorado Volunteers against the Texans. Yes, he goes back and commits atrocities against indigenous peoples in his own state.
Okay.
And that also
sounded familiar. Yeah.
No, yeah. All of these people, I hate to say it, you're looking at a who's who of terrible people in dealing with indigenous relations. And now, mind you, you could argue some of these people were misunderstood, and obviously if you look at the context and things like that maybe they're not, maybe they thought they were doing good at the time, but the reality is, in hindsight's always 20/20. But I think in several instances here, we have people that having more tolerant and flexible ideas would have served everyone better than what they did.
Well, there were plenty of Christian preachers and humanitarians in that day also, and a lot of them had a lot of influence, and they were well heard. So if these folks ignored them, they had made that choice. It was definitely what they wanted to be doing.
Shivington was a minister, wasn't he?
Yes, he was. Yes, he was.
There's another way of using the Bible to justify whatever it is you want to do.
Yeah. Yeah, and obviously, and I want to be clear about this. As we just talked, this was a case example, right? We're talking about the Bosque Redondo Indian Reservation in Fort Sumner, but it's an example of a broader trend that is occurring in the 19th century towards indigenous peoples. And it's happening. It's important to note that while we tend to look at it through the lens of the United States government, and obviously we should, that similar actions were occurring across the globe with European peoples in Africa, in Asia, and in Australia during this time period, following very similar policies. And I don't say this to say, well, then this is just one of a million cases, but also to say that these thoughts were not just the product of a few bad apples in New Mexico, but rather a systemic problem amongst Western societies in the 19th century, which is why I think it's important specifically that Western audiences learn about these places and learn that these actions occurred and learn that these things can happen and do happen. And it's very easy to point to the Germans as the bad guys in World War II, and certainly they did some very, very terrible things. However, they were not the first Western society to do so. And many of these things could be learned from, I believe, if we took the time to listen to the past. That's my soapbox for the day. At any rate, thank you very much. Bye, guys.